What's going on, everybody over at DC Fans? This is Rob, and I was asked to make a video on the history of the Dominators, and I'll tell you guys right now, this was no easy task. Information on the Dominators is scant at best, and it's difficult to form a whole cohesive thing because they were kind of like this really bright blip for a really short amount of time, for about a year or two. And then after that, it was just kind of like, and they've just been relegated to the background. But the reason why this was done was to actually serve a very, very important purpose in DC Comics on two fronts. So, doing a little bit of backstory here, the Dominators first appeared in Adventure Comics number 361 in 1967, and they were created by Jim Shooter. But the way they were originally done, they were designed to be really just kind of like a background element to the existing concept of the Legion of Superheroes. And to sidetrack for a second, the Legion of Superheroes was never designed to be a monumental success, or I guess never designed to be the monumental success that it turned out to be in DC Comics. Instead, they were originally just designed to be a one-off. In the Superboy line of publications, or I guess the Superboy stories that were taking place in Adventure Comics at the time, Superboy was still wildly popular among the general fan base. But the idea was to basically expand the mythos of the Superman and Superboy concepts as a whole under the editorial direction of a guy named Mort Weisinger. Now, it was under Weisinger that we got Comet the Super Horse and Streaky the Super Cat, Beppo the Super Monkey, and Supergirl. But the Legion of Superheroes was introduced to basically say, hey, there's this team in the 30th century that basically idolizes you, that looks at Superboy as their basis for becoming superheroes, and they really operate using him as kind of this idol to aspire to. And the result was that the Legion of Superheroes turned out to be insanely popular. And so over the course of, I think about a year or so, eventually Superboy was kind of bumped out of Adventure Comics. He got his own publication, and then the Legion of Superheroes took over his spot in Adventure Comics. And so because of this, we saw some pretty cool stories, but for the Dominators themselves, they were never a huge deal. In fact, they were really just like, they were just being escorted. They were like this bluish alien race. They were just kind of being escorted in this, not really like an intergalactic war, but in this intergalactic peace conference between these planets that were trying to gain power and so on and so forth. And the result was that nothing ever really came of them after that. But this all came to a head in 1985. Now, for those of you guys who are familiar with Crisis on Infinite Earths, bear with me for a second because there are a lot of people out there who are not. So prior to Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC's landscape in terms of its continuity was very, very difficult to follow. A really good example of this is Wonder Girl Donna Troy. She initially appeared in a way to introduce her as the allegory to Superboy for Superman, in the sense that Wonder Girl told the stories of Wonder Woman when she was a little girl. And it was very, very popular and did really well. The problem with this was that when the original Teen Titans team was launched, when the first iteration appeared in DC Comics, Wonder Girl was rolled over into that publication. And so continuity issues began to arise when fans looked around and they said, well, if Wonder Girl is supposed to be Wonder Woman as a little girl in the past, then why is she in the present day? This was one of only a series of things that caused problems, to say nothing of the fact that you had like multiple universes and so on and so forth. And so a lot of fans found it really, really difficult to get into DC publications at the time. And so under the direction of George Perez and Marv Wolfman, DC basically stopped everything. They said, just stop it all. We're going to launch a year-long event called Crisis on Infinite Earths. We're going to wipe the slate clean and we're going to start from zero. Now, in the post-Crisis on Infinite Earths continuity, there were two things that came out of that, or at least a lot of things that came out of that, but for our discussion, there were two main things that came out of that. The newest iteration of the Legion of Superheroes and Justice League International. And the reason why these two things are important is because the Dominators helped to form a more cohesive landscape by having the seeds of the invasion story arc planted in Justice League International, and then having Legion of Superheroes play a larger role in the future when it came to how the Dominators functioned, in the 30th century. But when they were originally reintroduced by Keith Giffen, the Dominators were essentially reimagined. They weren't nearly as mysterious as they looked before, and instead they were much darker, and they were designed to look intrinsically evil. And because of this, what DC did is they said, okay, let's do a line-wide event. And this is why the invasion storyline is so important, is because it's really like the first major line-wide crossover of DC Comics following Crisis on Infinite Earths. Crisis on Infinite Earths set the standard that fans love to see all the superheroes coming together. Granted, Crisis on Infinite Earths was a multiversal crossover. It was really all the superheroes from across the multiverse, or as many that, that were left behind. But the basis is that fans like to see a multitude of superheroes, teaming up. And the reason why is because prior to this, prior really to Invasion itself, whenever you saw crossovers, it was like Earth 1 and Earth 2. It was like the Justice League and the Justice Society, but it wasn't like all the superheroes everywhere. Not only that, Justice League International, as it was written by Keith Giffen, also gave a more global approach to the Justice League itself. Instead of reinventing reinventing the team as 7 of the most popular characters or the most powerful characters on, I guess, Earthbound superheroes. Instead, we got this huge conglomerate of superheroes from across the world. And the result was that we got a lot more equal representation when it came to superheroes from different walks of life. And so what happened with Invasion is when, the Dominators showed up, it was more or less this case of Keith Giffen writing that, hey, these Dominators as they exist now in the 20th century have been examining superheroes. They've been examining human beings, and they came to the realization that humans inherently have something called the metagene. Now, this is something that changed DC Comics forever. Now, the reason why is because prior to the introduction of the metagene in the Invasion storyline, there had never really been any indication that there was a cohesive concept as to why heroes got their powers. Instead, it just seemed to be chance. It just seemed to be that one day Barry Allen was working in a lab and he was splashed with chemicals and he became the Flash. One day Jay Garrick was working, in a lab somewhere and he inhaled some chemicals and he became the Flash. One day Hal Jordan was set upon by Emerald Ring and then suddenly he became a Green Lantern. Superman, was cast out of a dying planet with a red sun, and he landed on a planet with a yellow sun, and then now he has all these powers. There really didn't seem to be a common thread among these. Instead, it was either just rhyme or reason, or it was just they were born that way in the case of Wonder Woman. And so because of this, what happened with the metagene is, while it wasn't necessarily this idea that the metagene gave birth to powers, what it did is it said that people in DC Comics are inherently predisposed to gaining powers. And so the metagene is why Barry Allen's skin didn't melt off, when he was splashed with chemicals, and instead he became the Flash. The metagene is why it is that Hal Jordan got the Green Lantern ring instead of anybody else. It's just this idea that people are predisposed to becoming superheroes and then acting accordingly. The issue with this is that the Dominators had looked at the idea of superheroes and said, well, then a time will come when they will be a danger to all existence. And so by the very fact that the Dominators wanted to expand their own sphere of control, they in turn launched an attack against Earth. Now, the way that Invasion worked, it was an amalgamation of different races. It was really like this coalition of alien races. But the Dominators were the ones pulling the strings, and the Dominators were the ones behind it. Now, of course, I'm sure DC fans will have a video on the actual events inside the Invasion story arc, so I won't ruin that too much. And of course, we're going to see it in the major crossovers, so we'll be left to kind of see how that unfolds on its own. But the idea here was that at the same time that this was happening, Keith Giffen was also writing the Legion of Superheroes. Now, this newest iteration of the Legion of Superheroes was designed to hail back to its pre-crisis roots, but the kicker here was that under the writing of Keith Giffen, Volume 3, which had ran for around 63 issues, I think, ended with a story called The Magic Wars. And The Magic Wars basically allowed Keith Giffen to go into the early 1990s, starting issue number 4 and picking up with an event called 5 Years Later. And what 5 Years Later did is it basically took the Legion of Superheroes and it said, here's 5 years after the end of Magic Wars, and this entire story arc is designed to basically fill in the gaps in between. And what happened is he said that the Legion of Superheroes had effectively been cast out of Earth. They'd been exiled. We didn't really know why. But over the course of the story arc, we learned that the Dominators themselves had actually infiltrated the planet Earth. They had effectively taken over the government, and they had forced the Legion of Superheroes out in order to ensure they had total control of the Earth itself. Now, where the Dominators were successfully defeated, the kicker to this is that going into the future of DC Comics, the Dominators didn't play that huge of a role that was comparable to the Invasion story arc or even to the 5 Years Later event in Legion of Superheroes. Instead, with the Earth having been destroyed at the end of the Terra Mosaics, 5 Years Later storyline in Legion of Superheroes, DC just basically took the concept of the Dominators and relegated them to the background, essentially just building on the legacy the Dominators had created. And what I mean by this is the Dominators in and of themselves aren't wildly important because they've only appeared in about 144 issues, which really isn't that many when you sit down and think about it, especially when you consider reprints and annuals and so on. The reason why the Dominators are important, though, is because they created cohesiveness to a continuity that previously didn't have it. In DC, before the Dominators Invasion event, you really had instances where there would be an alien race that would be considered technologically advanced, light years beyond human beings, or I guess years beyond human beings, that would have interstellar travel and so on, but they would appear once and then they would never be referenced again and no one would have ever heard of them. When you had alien invasions, the Justice League might fight them, but then they'd never be referenced again in any form or fashion. But after Invasion, you had the Dominators, who were of course cast out by the superheroes, but in light of their actions when they set off this gene bomb in the Invasion story arc, you had a multitude of normal humans gaining abilities, and this was referenced consistently throughout DC Comics. Somewhere along the line, somebody would say something akin to the idea that, well, because of the Dominators, we now have more superhumans than we did before. Whether it was, Argus, whether it was Star Labs, whoever it is, somebody would make reference to it. Sometimes it would just be a passing comment from Amanda Waller. Not only that, the Dominators and Invasion also created this idea that there was going to be alien races that would pop up and then they would continue to be referenced simply because of the fact that they existed. They wouldn't pop up in one comic and then vanish from, history in some black bag somewhere. Instead, they would continue to play a role regardless of how marginal or how large that role may be in the overall concept of DC Comics. But with that being said, again, it was really tough for me to find a whole lot of information about the Dominators. This video is kind of limited in terms of providing a more cohesive explanation in terms of their, publication history and so on. I guess I could go through each individual issue, but all that would really boil down to is, and they appeared in this issue once by this person and did this thing. They were referenced one time and that was it, or they showed up in a panel or something like that. Aside from some time in the Green Lantern Corps storylines for a little while, they really didn't do a whole lot within the realm of DC Comics going forward. Instead, they were just kind of referenced, they'd play minor roles, and that would really be about it. But with that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you guys enjoyed this, make sure you guys subscribe to DC Fans, and if you guys enjoyed this video, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.